Anthony Albanese, welcome back to Lateline.
Good to be with you, Emma.
The Senate voting reforms were always going to pass the Parliament. The government had the numbers. So what was achieved by keeping everyone in the Senate all night?
Well, that, of course, wasn't our decision. It's the government's decision to bring this on at the last minute. It was clear that it was going to go through because of the deal that they'd done with the Greens political party. But it does say something about this government, that the last thing that they wanted to do before they raced to an election isn't something for the Australian people. It was something for themselves. And they weren't concerned about the jobs of Australians. It was about the jobs of Green senators and coalition senators.
But is it altogether clear what the impact will be of these voting reforms, given the Parliamentary Library itself did some research which finds that actually, on the basis of the 2013 election, the number of crossbenchers under the new system would be 11 rather than the 8 we have there now?
There is no possibility that you'll have 11 crossbench MPs as a result of this legislation, because quite clearly overnight as well, Minister Cormann confirmed that it would not be an offence to go out and argue just vote one. And clearly what we'll see is a move to optional preferential. What that means, at the moment, 1 in 4 Australians doesn't vote for either Labor, Liberal, National or Greens. So of those people, most of those ballot papers will end up being exhausted, that is, put in the bin, not being allocated to anyone, therefore disenfranchising up to 1 in 4 votes.
But isn't it clear that a system needs fixing when Nick Xenophon, for instance, manages to snare 25% of the primary vote and wins 1 seat, while Ricky Muir gets just half of 1% of the primary vote and also gets just 1 seat?
I tell you what, he got more votes than Michaelia Cash in the Senate, who got to be a minister in the government. Now, I think that there is a problem with the system and there was a way of reforming it. What I would have supported is thresholds, so that you needed to get a percentage of the vote, otherwise your votes automatically got distributed to someone else. That's one way to do it.
So is 0.5% enough?
No, quite clearly it's not. And I don't support the status quo. But what I don't support is just saying that we'll have a system whereby essentially the Greens are able to draw up the drawbridge behind them once they've crossed the river. Bob Brown wasn't elected with a quota of votes, nor have, when new Senate forces have emerged, including Nick Xenophon, been elected with full quotas. Now, I'm a major party guy. I believe in voting for a party of government. That's why I'm in the Labor Party as the progressive party of government. But I don't think that you can have that position and just dismiss everyone else as being wrong and say you'll discard their votes if they happen to want to vote for a minor party.
Most of this week in Canberra has been spent watching Labor launch a fairly scathing attack against the Greens. Is that because you think they should just always side with Labor in policy disagreements between the two major parties?
No, it's because of the lack of transparency there. You've had Michael Kroger speak about the informal agreement, as he'd call it. It's a deal that's been brokered in Victoria between the Greens and the Liberals, whereby...
To be fair, Michael Kroger said they would be prepared to look at an informal arrangement. He didn't say a deal had been done per se.
No, he doesn't call it a deal, but he's confirmed that negotiations have taken place, and we know in terms of what that outcome is connected with this. And that's why it's connected with Senate reform, because what this Senate reform does, historically, Labor has assisted Greens to get elected in the Senate because of the way that last position is filled. By moving to a position of optional preferential, the Greens think we don't need that anymore, so we can afford to do arrangements in the lower house whereby the Liberals will be prepared to give them support, preferences in seats that the Greens think they can win, and in return the Greens would assist Liberals to be elected in marginal electorates by issuing open tickets.
But there is a certain irony here, isn't there, in your singling out of the Greens, given your own party is split on the matter. Gary Gray, who until just 2 weeks ago was the opposition minister responsible for this particular area of policy, said the voting reforms would, quote, genuinely improve the operation of our Electoral Act.
Well, it's not the overwhelming view of the party, and one person in the caucus had that view that I know of. No one else in the debates.
The single person who was most engaged in the matter.
Well, in terms of the processes, we examined what the legislation was that was put forward, and the legislation that was put forward had already been stitched up between the Liberals and the Greens. We don't believe that it is in the long-term interests of the democratic process to entrench a circumstance whereby new parties will never emerge, to entrench a circumstance whereby it is likely, because the coalition, if you look state by state, the normal Senate elections, the coalition can expect under this system to get 3 in every state, a minimum, and 1 in the territories. That will give it, over a period of time, 38 senators, which will give it the right of veto as a minimum in terms of the operation of the Senate. We don't believe that's sensible reform. We don't think that the Greens thought this through, and indeed I think it will result in the Greens losing a senator from South Australia at a double D election.
Well, speaking of double D elections, 22 MPs and senators are retiring at the next election, and it was curious to watch as many of them gave valedictory speeches yesterday, including Gary Gray, who we just mentioned, Ian Macfarlane and Teresa Gambaro on the other side. Does that suggest to you that a double dissolution election, i.e. not coming back after the budget, is a fait accompli?
Absolutely. And I think it's quite extraordinary that the government is not being transparent about when the budget will be. We don't know. We've left the parliament now. It's got up for the session. We're supposed to come back on May 10. But the government knows. We don't, that there's a possibility of it bringing the budget forward to May 3. We know that all the expectations are that the election should be 3 years from when the parliament sat, so it should be around about November of this year. But the only way you can have a double D election is to bring it forward to July 2. And the circumstances whereby you would bring down a budget and then rush to an election without any proper scrutiny and the normal budget Senate estimates process that takes place just shows that this is a government without a sense of purpose, without an agenda. And it says something about this Senate reform, that the deal was stitched up as a final agreement between the Greens and the coalition, but then they had to amend it in the House, and then they had to amend the legislation again in the Senate, showing that it's flawed. We'll wait and see what proper scrutiny of this legislation finds, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if there are major issues created because of the way that this legislation has been rushed through without proper scrutiny.
Finally, today is the National Day of Action Against Bullying and Violence, and we see that Minister Birmingham has made a decision in response to the review of the Safe Schools program. George Christensen MP has said that this was never an anti-bullying program, but now it is, because of what he says it's no longer queer theory being taught in the classroom. What's your assessment of the government's decision around this?
Well, I'm pleased that the program is staying. If there are any sensible changes to be made, then so be it. I haven't had a chance to scrutinise it. But this is an important program, and it's important that we do stand up against bullying in schools. It can be very difficult for a young person coming to terms with their sexuality, and the last thing they need is intolerance and bullying in schools, and the last thing this parliament needs is the sort of bullying approach that we've seen from George Christensen, including an outrageous speech under parliamentary privilege this week.
Anthony Albanese, we need to leave it there, but I do thank you so much for spending this extra bit of time with us, having spent too much time as it was this week in that place. Thank you.
Indeed. Thanks, Emma.